Welcome, everyone. About to get started. Thanks so much for coming out this Monday evening. We typically do afternoon events. We were experimenting with an evening event and really grateful for you to take the time out of take your free time to join us. I'm Nick Benaquista. I'm the research manager at the Center for International Media Assistance, which is a part of the National Endowment for Democracy. NED is known, of course, as an important supporter of democracy through its grants to civil society organizations and citizen groups around the world. Less well known about NED is that nearly a quarter of its grants globally are directed towards strengthening the independence and pluralism of media around the world, which is to say that NED truly recognizes the centrality and importance of media for democracy. As a further recognition of the importance of media, CIMA was created about 11 years ago as a think tank within NED. We're a small team here at NED. Our mission at CIMA, and Mark Nelson is our director here, is to keep an eye on the changing threats to media around the world and to foster knowledge on how to effectively meet these threats. In that regard, today's event is on an issue that we consider to be, and I hesitated in using this word, but I'm going to stick with it, a preeminent threat to media freedom, and that's media capture. While many threats to independent journalism, including the threat of violence and forms of state censorship, persist today, we have witnessed a growing reliance on the economic levers of control for suppressing dissent by authoritarian governments around the world. These techniques of capture, as it's been termed, take advantage of the current weaknesses in media markets. And I think what makes it so especially dangerous nowadays is that the international community, regulators, local activists, and journalists themselves are not entirely prepared to meet this challenge. Hopefully, though, with the attention of the people such as those that we have today on the stage and those of you who are in the audience, we hope that with further effort we will be prepared to meet this challenge. This event was convened to mark the launch of a new book on this topic. I should have brought a copy with me. Oh, thank you. In the Service of Power, Media Capture and the Threat to Democracy. It's edited by Anya Schifrin, who's on the stage, and will say more words about the book. So with that, I'll just introduce our moderator, Jennifer Cobb, who is the Vice President for Communications and Outreach at Internews, an organization based here in Washington that works around the world to empower people with trustworthy information. So Jennifer will introduce the rest of our panelists, and once again, thank you very much from NED and from CIMA for joining us, and I hope you have a fruitful discussion.
Thanks so much. So welcome. I want to thank CIMA and for the panel for convening this important conversation and for this new volume, which is really, I think, comes at a very critical time in the development of independent media. So I think most of us are aware media capture is nothing new. Like a lot of the problems that we're seeing around the world, it's something that's probably as old as media itself. In fact, Internews has worked in more than 100 countries over the last 35 years, and I think we would be pretty hard-pressed to find a single place where media capture was not in play in some way. However, I think as this volume highlights so well, media capture stock is on the rise very quickly. And it is now a primary strategic tool for autocrats and kleptocrats, and it's really threatening democracy everywhere. I think there are really a couple of key reasons for this, which I'll go through quickly to frame the conversation and are also highlighted in the volume. Really at the top of the list, and why this volume is critical right now, is that we're in a new age. We're in the age of digital media. And as media markets have transitioned to digital, the business models have collapsed and making media organizations weak and vulnerable to capture. Media markets have also increasingly consolidated in this new environment, and this trend is not improving. A second issue is that digital media has really allowed authoritarians to evolve their models. So the old model of rule by terror, you know, kind of rounding people up in the middle of the night and putting guns to their heads, really is pretty passé at this point. These days, most regimes realize that media and digital information is an easier, cheaper, and much more effective way to control populations. Another factor is increasing wealth concentration. If you want to keep and increase your wealth, it turns out to be a whole lot smarter and more direct to just buy the media than it was to bribe it. So this volume really lifts the covers, I think, on capture in the digital age. As a famous Russian who wasn't an oligarch once said, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And I bring that up because I think there really is a capture playbook, and I think this volume looks at the various elements of the playbook, but those elements tend to configure and reconfigure in very specific ways depending on the political, economic, or cultural environment in which they're functioning. And I think that's another thing this volume does well, is it takes us from Burma to China to Africa and Czechoslovakia and around the world and looks at how capture is playing out in these different environments. So to help us unpack these issues, I think we're very fortunate to have 4 renowned experts with us. So to my immediate left is Anya Schifrin, who's the editor of the volume and the Director of Technology, Media and Communications at SIPA, the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia. To her left is Andrea Pratt, who also comes to us from the Columbia Business School and is a professor of political economy and industrial organizations and has done a lot of work on media capture and media power, which he'll help unpack for us. To his left is Olaf Steenfatt, who's the project director at Reporters Without Borders of an important new project, the Media Ownership Monitor, which looks country by country at who owns the media, seeking greater transparency, which is a key element in combating capture. And finally, we have Mark Nelson, who's the senior director here at CIMA, and who authored the final chapter in the book, which is actually the most hopeful and forward-looking one that looks at what can we actually do. So hopefully we'll get into some of that today as well. So with that, I think I'll just kick it off and let everyone sort of frame the conversation for us. Yeah.
Is this working?
I
turn it on, actually. It is on. Yes, people can hear me now? Great, thank you. Well, thanks so much to everyone for coming out. It's been really gratifying to see how interested people are in this arcane subject of media capture. And I'm very honored to be on a panel with so many distinguished people. I got interested in media capture a few years ago, really because of reading a paper by Andrea Pratt about it, which was published in the early 2000s, and also the work of Tim Besley. And I'm not an economist, but I like to try to understand economics papers sometimes. And I was really intrigued to see that a small group of economists, really just 2 or 3 people, had taken George Stigler's idea of regulatory capture and adapted it to the media. And the idea of regulatory capture was developed, I guess, in the 1970s to explain why regulators often end up not regulating the industries that they're supposed to be regulating. Alina Minju-Pipiti refers to it as sort of poacher turned gamekeeper, or the other way around, gamekeeper turned poacher, I don't know. So I started reading their work and thought that's actually sort of fascinating. The idea that people become so beholden to the people that are supposed to be regulating that they no longer do it, and they get sort of caught. And of course, when you think of some of the theories about media, like Herb Gantz's work on beat reporters and how they become ambassadors for their beats, or some of the work on soft censorship, it became clear to me that media capture sort of fit into this category of sort of soft censorship and worries about media ownership, but that it hadn't been kind of fully examined by the sort of media development community and by communication scholars. So I thought it was time to really sort of bring it to all of us to start thinking about. And there were a few reasons I wanted to do that. One was the literature that was written in the early 2000s. I think we were all much more optimistic about the internet then. And so the sort of storyline or the implicit assumption was that the internet would lower barriers to entry and therefore produce more competition, and that would be a really good thing for the media. And of course it turned out that it wasn't, that it lowered quality in many cases as there was a race to the bottom, And also that as the business model was destroyed, it changed the incentives for people owning media outlets, right? If you can't make money, why are you going to do it? For status or for power? So I thought, it's really time to look at those theories of media capture in light of all the changes that have happened in the last 15 years. And then a couple of papers really sort of triggered my interest. One was the Andy Finkel piece, which I think you published, on Turkey. And then Moises Naim wrote about Venezuela and how the government, I don't think it was Chavez at that time, was secretly selling media outlets to friends and allies. And Greece, of course. I was in Greece during the financial crisis one summer and saw how the media coverage was so contingent on the point of view of the oligarchs. Obviously, closer to home, there's Murdoch, there's Adelson. So I thought it was really time to look at this. So we had a conference at Columbia in 2016, and it was one of those things where everybody from around the world kept writing and saying they wanted to come. We got paper proposals from many different countries, and we ended up having a really full, interesting day with people speaking from Tunisia and from Egypt and Hong Kong and Burma. So we got a whole lot of papers, and Mark and Nick were really supportive right away and understood that this was something we needed to publish. So we published this collection, and then a second volume has come out as a special issue of Journalism, which is more academic and more theoretical. And now you may all want to write papers or have ideas for the next volume, which will be about capture in the digital age with Columbia University Press. So it's been super interesting to kind of see the reactions all around the world. And then this is a personal story I haven't actually shared with anybody. At one point, I was thinking about media capture and why am I so interested in media capture? And I suddenly remembered that both my grandfather and my father had founded publishing companies that were bought by big corporations, and they both got fired 50 years after each other. And I thought, oh, of course, how Freudian. This is why I'm so obsessed with this subject. So I'm glad it turns out that other people are too. And thank you very much for being here.
Great.
I really enjoyed Anya's work, and I think it's very important. Is it on? Try again. It does say on. Can you hear me? Okay, fantastic. So I really enjoyed Anya's work because it shows both the depth. This is something that's been happening for over a long period of time, and it's changing over time. I like the thing of the grandparents, and it's also. It happens in so many countries. There are elements that are common. There are elements that are very specific to different countries. We're trying to understand. It's super important. And my approach is a bit, being an economist, I'm kind of great at generalizations, right? That's what we do as economists. And my general, one of the starting points is what makes it more likely. So what makes it, media is this wonderful thing that can allow us to keep politicians accountable, right? And, but of course politicians have a great interest in trying to control the media and trying to make deals with the media. And what makes it more likely that they will succeed in this? Well, it's when media is big, when it's concentrated. There are many other factors, but this is clearly one of the most important ones. If you're in a country where a large chunk of the media is controlled by few owners, it's gonna be, everybody's gonna be very tempted to get a deal. Get a deal, which means let's manipulate the democratic process, and let's all gain from this. We'll be nice to the media owners, whatever their interests are, and the media will be nice to the government. And we witness this in so many parts of the world, and in fact there is evidence. We have evidence for this in places of the world, going from Peru, Russia, my home country of Italy, which is probably what made me interested in this topic to start with. So if concentration is the problem, then it's important to measure this. It's important to measure this in various ways. It sounds simple, but it faces two big challenges. One is to figure out who owns what, and Olaf will tell you more. It's a really hard challenge. The other one is to figure out exactly what concentration means. And here the problem is that we have a proliferation of platforms. In the past, it used to be newspapers, television, it was relatively easy. Then we started having cable, internet, all kind of social media. So we could try and chase these platforms and try to figure out in each platform what, but there's a better way of doing it, which is to start asking ourselves not what the share is on individual platforms, but what the share is in the voter's attention. So for each voter, we can try to figure out where they get their news from, and so who is able to manipulate that specific voter. If we aggregate that information, we get a very good sense of who controls the democratic process in a country. So that's what I've been engaged in doing for the past 5 years. I've done it first for the US with various sources, and recently I've done it for 18 countries. So the raw data kind of it's various forms of surveys that take random people and tries to get to the question, where do you get your political news from, including all platforms, from the traditional ones to Twitter, Facebook, whatever can bring news to you. And I now have, I circulated a discussion paper that's available online with 18 countries, so your feedback is would be very welcome. Big patterns, we find that, so it's too early to write off old platforms. Television is still big. It's still big if we're regulators, if we're interested in ownership. Television is big in all 18 countries. It's also early to write off newspapers. They're still very important. And actually, once you add the people who read them online, it's actually they control a significant chunk of the attention in all of these countries. The other team in regulatory team has to do with public service broadcasting. So in many of these countries, the biggest chunk of the attention is controlled by the state television. State television regulation is a huge question. We go from, institutions like the BBC that have wonderful governance to institutions that are basically directly controlled by the Prime Minister. So there's everything in between.
Thank you very much for the invitation to CIMA and for having me. I assume we didn't discuss it in advance, but I assume my role is to add the flavor of civil society, NGO, and activism to this, in addition to academia. I work for Reporters Without Borders, which you might have heard of, probably mostly through our flagship project, which is the World Press Freedom Index, which we publish every year, and which basically reflects threats against journalism or journalists, which of course are still, and we've heard it already earlier, are mostly physical and legal. So simply journalists get killed or hurt or are jailed. But increasingly with this work on the World Press Freedom Index, we got an understanding and sense that there is behind the curtain, violence is quite visible and makes headlines. The economic dimension of basically inhibiting independence of journalism. And this was a little bit surprising if you think of it and about it a little bit more, because it comes as a paradox. One might think these days that the internet is the golden bullet for media pluralism because it provides unlimited space and unlimited choice. So where's the problem? And at the same time, and this is what I mean by paradox, concentration of media, mainly by media capture, increases everywhere. And when I say media concentration, it has different dimensions. First of all, obviously it happens globally with this duopoly of Google and Facebook. It definitely happens on national levels, but probably, that's my personal observation, most worrying on local levels, where you have, I come from Germany, parts of our country which are white spots where there is no journalism anymore. And this is an ultimate result of media concentration and capture. But you don't have media concentration only on the supply side, media outlets, but also on the demand side, which again is a bit surprising. Theoretically and technically speaking, every one of us has the maximum unlimited abundance of offer. But if you look into what people are actually consuming as content, it's getting narrower and narrower. I mean, people speak about the filter bubble, for example, which is definitely one symptom in this. And then you have concentration, and this is also what we try to look at along the value chain. So it's not only buying up radio stations or TV stations, but it's including advertising, it's including even market research firms, production companies, distribution networks, cable, mobile, etc. And it reaches out also to other industries. And this is, I think, also a trend we can see happening worldwide, that other than in the good old analog days, where still at the end of the day media operations was about profit, mainly today, due to the failing business models, in many, many cases, media owners are happy to take losses. It's perfectly okay, because they cross-subsidize their media operation by whatever else they do, and see it as an investment in public opinion. So with this kind of situation before us, we were asking ourselves two questions at Reporters Without Borders. One was, how come? And secondly, what can we do about it? I am skipping the how come part a little bit. We might get to this later, but the bottom line there is that, and this, I cannot stress this enough, really comes also as a shift of paradigm inside our own organization, that we begin to understand that it's the economy, stupid, so to say. So it is really about the understanding that you cannot sustain independent journalism if the business model or the media landscape is not healthy. And then if we secondly ask ourselves what to do about it, we started to believe that it is first about transparency of ownership to begin with. And we didn't stop there by just calling for transparency, but went one step further and actually deliver this transparency, as mentioned before, by we started this project, Media Ownership Monitor 2015, and basically go country by country, not so much as academia probably, but more like data journalism, with a goal to basically put a face, the picture of a face next to the logo of a newspaper or TV or radio station or website. And provide a very simple to use instrument, not so much for us and ourselves, the experts, but for the ordinary person on the street to find out with 2 or 3 clicks who is behind. And when I say who's behind, it's not so much the legal ownership, like company X owning company Y, owning company Z, but it's really getting down to people, to persons, and to contextualize, which I believe is also very important to stress, which political and economic interests of each and every person is behind, and describe it and explain it in a way with infographics and language that hopefully we believe everyone can understand, and that should at least contribute to media literacy of the general public in the countries where we've been so far, but of course also, and we might come to this later, to meaningful regulation of the sector. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, in thinking about this topic, I would go back to where we started, Jennifer, where you said this is nothing new, and I agree with that. But I think media capture as we're seeing it today is fundamentally different than what we have seen in the past, in the sense that we're seeing more and more countries where the entire media system, all the owners are in cahoots with the regime. Now, we've had many places where there have been industrial media owners and attempts to establish, control over a significant part of the population and the public opinion of that population. But what we're seeing today is more and more countries where most of the main owners are working deliberately and systematically with the power structure. So unlike the old Soviet Union, where the country had to establish control of the media space through power, imposition of power over that, you no longer have to do that, because you can. It's an approach that allows wealthy individuals to establish very, very strong influence in countries and to work with people in power to get regulatory and other economic favors for their other holdings, which are typically not media holdings. As I think Andrea said, they tend to be spread in other industrial areas or in telecoms or other big industries. And owning a media property can really help you figure out how to improve the prospects of your organization and your industry. The place that was sort of the poster child for this is, of course, Turkey, which was the first paper we published on this, and I was just astounded to see the extent to which the Erdogan regime had managed to control the media space in that country in really, really far-reaching ways, even though there still is a rather wide diversity of ownership of the media there. But everybody's working for the same guy. And the other really important sort of realization about this came when I was in Indonesia in 2016, when I was invited to the president's office to meet with some of his staff. And we sat down with this incredibly well-informed, well-read group of advisors to President Widodo, who is trying to implement governance reforms and trying to keep a fairly progressive economic and social change program in place, and to continue that country's fairly steady economic growth. And we sat down and they brought all these papers with them of studies of the media landscape in Indonesia and studies of the owners of the media in Indonesia and policy papers where people had suggested certain kinds of regulatory and policy changes that could be implemented by the regime. And it was extraordinary to hear the extent to which all those advisors were really well informed about what was going on in the country, that the country still had 12 big owners in the media space. Most of those owners were associated with political parties. So you had a lot of diversity and some competition in the media space. But underlying this entire conversation was a really, really troubling worry that they were having about the fact that how long is this going to last? How long are we going to have this competition among the parties? And are we going to have a situation in this country too, where the economic forces and the political forces come together and bring somebody into power, and they all are behind the same group, and then they can really take things under control? So I think that, those kinds of hybrid environments are where we're trying to really look at CIMA, and trying to think about those places where we might be able to influence some of these places as they consider what they can do about this. Because one of the things that we did learn by doing this work and by the conference in Colombia and by some of the other things that we've done here at CIMA is that it's not hopeless. There are things that informed governments and informed civil society groups can do to slow this down and to put the brakes on the move toward capture. I mean, you're not going to be able to do anything about China or Russia right now, but there are places like Indonesia, like a lot of middle income and upper lower middle income countries where there is still a competition in the media space, where there's still an underregulated media environment, where the government has not really found its voice or figured out what it should be doing in this environment, and where civil society has a lot of understanding about what's happening, but probably do not know enough about this topic to really do effective change. So what I tried to do in my chapter was to talk about that. And maybe we can get into some of the details about that as we go along.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I completely agree with you, Mark. I mean, on many points, with all of you, I find it's, we've noticed around the world, oligarchs are just on a buying spree. I mean, pretty much everywhere. And as one of my colleagues in E&E says, you're not really arrived as an oligarch until you have a Lamborghini, a Swedish model girlfriend, and a media company. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I mean, it really has become a vanity project, too, for some of these oligarchs.
It's becoming the dominant ownership model for media in the world.
Yes, well, and partly it's in the wake of the 2008 recession. Media companies became very cheap and easy to buy. And then also in the wake of the recession, you have a lot of very disgruntled populations around the world that are turning to more far-right parties, and that leads me to what happened over the weekend, which is in the Czech elections, which I think is a really useful case study for this exact issue, which is, I don't know how many of you followed the outcomes of the Czech elections, but the winner by 30% was a far-right, really a very extreme far-right party run by an oligarch named Andres Babiš, thank you, who actually owns 2 newspapers and a radio station, and his newspapers reach 33% of the population, and he will be the next Prime Minister of Czechoslovakia, despite being currently investigated for financial crimes, which he, of course, calls fake news. So I think this is a really interesting example, which brings a lot of those pieces together, because for a long time, Czechoslovakia, we kind of pointed to as a really healthy, media
Certainly
environment.
on the way to being healthy.
Yeah, on the way to, we weren't so worried about Czechoslovakia. Let's just put it
actually
that
have a
way.
chapter in the book about the Czech Republic.
Yes.
And that's a case study of what you were just talking about. I think in the Balkans, Central Europe, I'm sure Olaf knows more about this than I do, Czech, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, German companies bought all these media outlets, and everyone was optimistic. I see Harlan nodding. You clearly have worked on this for decades. And people were optimistic, right? They're going to invest, they'll raise quality, they'll do training. And then I guess after 2008, a lot of these were sold off to local oligarchs, precisely what you said.
They fled the market. The market wasn't profitable anymore after 2008. So, it's a complex picture, of course. But I thought, Andrea, you might want to comment. You had some data about Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, actually, I just pulled them off my laptop earlier, and I think there's a slide. So this is the attention share of the various media owners in the Czech Republic. And as you can see, I did this before the election, right? As you can see, Babiš is the largest one with an attention share of 15%. All this data is highly imprecise, right? It's based on surveys and stuff, but it gives you a sense of someone. If you control 15% of the attention share, you can kind of move an election. And Mark, I think, hit on the real point. The economics of this is that media is cheap to buy. If you're an oligarch, you're worth billions, and this stuff is in the tens of millions at most. These are, it's very useful to have this. And in fact, from a point of view of a game theorist, you don't even have to use it in equilibrium, because the politicians know that they have to be afraid of this. I have to say, you guys think that this is a new phenomenon. It used to be the old style, except in Anglo-Saxon countries. So in my own country, Italy, all the newspapers for decades were controlled by large industrial groups. They were kind of bland in general, and then if the government tried to do something negative, they would attack very strongly the government, making sure that certain parties were always in power. So it's a traditional system, and now it becomes modernized because, of course, the internet is gonna do that. And so my worry is that these large internet conglomerates, for them, news is a very small part of their profit. So they're gonna be very pliable. If they're profit maximizers, they should be very pliable when it comes to not bothering governments, and we're going to have to see what happens. But I suppose the big question, and this is the question for the rest of the panel, is can we do something at the policy level by, for instance, prohibiting cross-ownership, asking that media outlets are owned by pure media companies that live and die by their media profits. Maybe that's one solution.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, but maybe just as an addition, if we speak about the motives why whoever does this and buys or owns media, what we see in many, many countries, more or less alike, is a very diverse pattern. It's too simple to believe that this is only this bidimensional politics and media relationship where it's basically about winning the next election. Yes, that happens a lot, but then you have also additional motives, like, for example, harm a competitor in a certain business sector, money laundering, organized crime of all different flavors. You have the churches with a strong impact, which sometimes is very political, sometimes it isn't. So a variety of motives. I mean, I can just give you one example. We did our project, actually, I think it was the first edition in Colombia, where you have a big oligarch who basically controls 2/3 of the Colombian television market and also online and radio and other media, but is also invested in more or less every business sector you can think of. For example, also beverages and beer, which means that on his TV channels you would only see commercials of his soft drink companies, which means that Coca-Cola, for example, has no access to 2/3 of the Colombian TV market as an advertiser, which inhibits competition in a totally different sector. And this is, I believe, also this is what we sense, an interesting argument talking to politicians, that this is not only about lofty human rights, freedom of expression, pluralism, things which everybody expects us to talk about when, you know, we come with this blinking human rights tag around the corner. But again, it's about growth and jobs in not only the creative industry, but the economy at large, which is inhibited by a large extent through media ownership. And maybe another example, you mentioned Turkey, how it looks really particularly in this case. If you look at that country and stats, it looks quite pluralistic because you have many, many very professional and well-funded media outlets. You have at least a dozen very well-made 24-hour news channels in Turkey alone. So you would think, where's the problem? And to get to that problem, down to it, you really have to look into the business model and also the content. And then you see that there is, without any exception, any mass media, national mass media outlet in Turkey owned by conglomerates, sectoral companies, which each one of them, without any exception, depend totally on government contracts in energy, ports, transportation, construction, defense, you name it. Now, if your main client is Erdogan, and you also own a little newspaper and TV station here and there, the editors and journalists don't need to receive calls to tell them what to write or not to write. It happens automatically. Mm-hmm. And by the way, there is no single case where Erdogan has not attended a wedding ceremony of these owners or even as a wedding witness.
I also think that you're pointing out something that is really important about Andrea's study, which is that you're looking at political news, right? So the ownership figures may not make it clear what outlets have the most influence. And so I think that point is really key.
Yeah.
That it's not, we know that the fashion magazines and the personal finance magazines are always affected by the content's affected by their owners. It doesn't matter as much as the political news.
When you ask about what can be done about it, and I think this work that RSF is doing to make these owners more transparent is really a tremendous addition to this, because you're able to at least be able to see the links between the owners and their positions and what's in their media and all of that. I think that transparency is one of the most important things. But Andrea, you ask about is there a chance of regulating cross-ownership of these industrial organizations and media? And my hunch on this is that we need to do a lot more education and building political will on this, and that's really what I concentrate on, and when I talk about the policy approaches that I'm talking about in my chapter. It's a lot about how to organize society to be engaged and understanding what's going on in the media space. And that's where we are really failing across the world. Mm-hmm. We don't have enough knowledge among legislators, among civil society organizations, among the media itself, the journalists and others who probably don't really understand exactly how these things are happening and how all of a sudden Turkey gets captured by this group of people who completely control the country. We're seeing it in many other countries where it's progressively moving in that direction. And it's going to require a lot of debate and discussion at the societal level before we get to something which right now, frankly, would affect the Washington Post. You know, we have Jeff Bezos that owns the Washington Post, which is, you know, in my, you know, experience of that newspaper, he saved that newspaper and made it possible for it to continue to be a strong voice in this environment here. So we've got some things we need to work on in terms of what in this new environment, in this digital age, constitutes incentives and policies that lead to diversity of ownership, to transparency of ownership, and to really making an effort as societies to define what we mean by the public interest. How do we define public interest journalism, and how do we as a society demand that and get it through the policies that are in place by our governments? Right now, that conversation is happening in only a very few places. I'm very happy that it's starting to happen in the United States, but when you go to many countries in the developing world and in, you know, emerging democracies, the extent to which the political and regulatory debate is really being debated in public is really limited, because it's very hard to understand what's happening. The ability of one country to manage its media space is limited because much of the media now is global, and much of it is coming across borders. So, you know, setting up some kind of rule in one country doesn't necessarily actually end up having an effect on the broader thing. So I think we need to have these debates in order to take this to the level of internet governance and global policies that can also interact on this and somehow stem some of these tendencies. So I'm a little bit skeptical that we could push or be taken as credible a push for eliminating cross-ownership, but I think that's the problem. I mean, I do think it's a problem, and I think it's one of those things that we need to bring into the open. I mean, are you aware of any place where this has been done, or?
No. I mean, if anything, we had cross-ownership rules that became obsolete because
Right.
they were, you know, among platforms that are now sort of irrelevant.
And it was about media cross-ownership rules.
Yeah.
It wasn't about.
Yeah.
It wasn't about media, not about the steel company owning the media company.
Exactly. I mean, definitely one big open question is competition policy. So competition policies is a big success story of the past 20 years. Right. We went from a situation where outside the US and a few other countries, people could build any economic power they wanted, to a situation where pretty much every democracy in the world has a competition policy agency, and they start to do things. I mean, China is starting to do stuff in that space. And that was a big success story because somehow we started from first principles. We asked ourselves, what's the ideal situation? And then we moved in that direction slowly. I think it's time to have a debate on what's the right competition policy for media, and to be completely open about what kind of answers we get. You know, cross-ownership might be one of them, transparency. The idea also, you guys know much more than that, how can we enshrine journalistic independence? So some kind of way that even if you own a media company, you cannot talk to the director or something like this. It could be, there could be many ways, and it would be very interesting to investigate that. From my point of view, what I'm trying to do for competition policy is to try and offer some kind of index, some kind of concentration index that goes beyond. So currently, what people use is the Herfindahl index, which is completely inappropriate for the media, because when you use these concentration indices, you look at platforms, you look at everything, you look at entertainment, and so it looks like Fox News, if you look those indexes, it's not a problem, absolutely not a problem. And so I'm trying to push indices like this one that kind of highlight the level of
That
concentration.
it's not about market share. That was one of your main points.
Exactly.
When
So
you look at
we
media
need to move,
mergers,
we
it's
need to
not-
move from market share to attention share, but it's just the beginning, I think.
I mean, when we call for or fight for independent journalism, as said earlier, a precondition we believe are healthy media landscapes, and there is no healthy media landscape without credible data. And I think data is really a key issue in two ways. One is availability. I mean, in many places, simply these types of data don't exist. I remember Cambodia, for example. You don't have it. So how would you ever try to regulate media concentration to begin with? Or even worse, data is being corrupted for a number of reasons. In Cambodia, this is also one example where you have, of course, circulation of newspapers, but newspapers are taxed according to their circulation. So owners try to put it very low to pay less taxes. While in Turkey, for example, you have a situation where the government runs an office that subsidizes mass media. And of course, they need also data to do that, which is totally false. I mean, that is really fake news. So we checked, you see a newspaper, for example, which leaves the print shop with 7,000 copies. And in this list of this government institution, it is ranked with 120,000 copies. And that's the number that establishes how much money, how much subsidies it gets from the state. So reliability of data is a big problem. And then the second dimension, which I'm sure everyone is struggling with, the methodology, how to compare cross media and cross-media ownership. How do you put, let's say, an X amount of clicks in comparison to a market share in audiovisual media? And then if it gets even more multidimensional with stakes in other sectors like distribution networks, which also comes into play, how do you measure and compare this? And obviously, because it also goes across borders, you need actually a global formula, a global approach, which, at least to my extent, is not existing until now. And I think also one part of the maybe problem is, and I see someone also from the FCC sitting in the auditorium can help. I mean, traditionally, regulators come from the audiovisual sector because that was the regulatory task, to distribute spectrum, airwaves, which was or still is scarcity, so you need to find a way of distributing it. So the way regulators tick is still very much audiovisual. And they currently, as we speak, try to come to terms with online and even print and also other means of distribution, and how to calculate and how to basically establish an understanding of concentration.
But I think so. My answer to that is that instead of going to the global level, you actually have to go to the individual, and you have to go individual by individual, figuring out where they get their information. This is doable. This is absolutely doable. It's not cheap. I did it with the data I have. So here is, for instance, I forget, it's about 2,000 Czech citizens, and for each of them, we know where they get their information from. So that solves the question of comparing clicks with pages, with television, because it's where it gets aggregated is in the attention, the mind of the voter. This is where information comes from, and so you can aggregate everything, and you can add platforms as they come in. So if a new platform gets invented 2 years from now, you can aggregate it in that system. What I would love media regulators to do is to do this much better than I can do it. It involves getting a sample of, and I think the US should start, or the EU, getting a sample of voters, following them over time, getting hard information on where they get their news from. We have tools for that, and then getting soft information on interviewing them, seeing what information they're trying to get. I'm trying to run experiments on this, try to figure out when there's an important piece of news in the US, who gets informed about it. Because in the end, that's what we care about. We don't care about the world dominance of a company, but we care exactly where voters get their information from.
Yeah, but just one quick follow-up, because this is what we are struggling with a lot at the moment. Which media outlets you would take into this equation? I mean, obviously, a fishing channel, even if it's, let's say, very successful, probably doesn't matter much for public opinion. But if, for example, you look into Latin America, where basically telenovelas are the big thing, I mean, it's fiction, yes, but it shapes public opinion to a large extent. So where do you draw the line?
Assumptions must be made, and you ask a question. You ask, for instance, most of these surveys they're based on last week. Where did you get your political information from? And obviously no one says a fishing channel. But some of them say Facebook, some of them say Twitter, and then Twitter and Facebook are in this. So the advantage of that is that it's open, it's up to the citizens to report where they get this news. Obviously, it's very hard because recall is always imperfect. So that's why it would be fantastic to do it in a much more professional way than we can do it.
So I would love to just sort of throw out another theme here, which I think is really some top of mind for a lot of us, and that really is trust. And we're seeing trust drop globally of media, except in China, which is very interesting. The Chinese trust their media a lot. And it's really a curious question because, here's China. They actually have a pretty diverse and pluralistic media market, which is tightly censored in one piece of it, but not so censored in other pieces. And, sort of the articles of faith we've all lived with, which is that the way to combat capture is to have diverse pluralistic markets, that starts to feel a little incomplete as an answer right now, especially since markets aren't going to be able to support lots of different players. It's increasingly hard. The business models are failing. But there was an interesting point that came out in the book that, I just wonder what you guys think of this, that over time people don't trust captured media. They kind of know it's captured on some level. And the other thing that happens is that captured media, because it's very full of resources compared to the independent media, pays its journalists really well, and then they become members of the elite, and then they stop being connected to the communities they cover. And so the media just feels like increasingly part of the big machine that's, running your life. So I just wonder, Anya, I know you've been doing some thinking about trust, but anyone else can weigh in on this.
Absolutely, and I do want to hear from the panel. I guess I have two thoughts. One is, I'm not sure, I think there's sort of anecdotes on both sides. I mean, Australia, doesn't Murdoch own something like, have control over 60% of circulation and viewership there? But a lot of people in Australia seem to view Murdoch almost as a kindly old uncle. So many journalists have worked at his newspapers. I once did a radio program where I made some rude remark about Murdoch, and with Australian radio, and they cut me off immediately. So that seems to be a place for sort of familiarity, all those studies that show people trust the media that they consume. So it may be that capture in some ways breeds omnipresence, breeds trust. But on the other hand, since I've been writing so much about trust right now, I've been trying to look for examples where people still do trust the media. And Sweden is, It's always Scandinavia, right? And once again, sorry, Sweden is where the public broadcasters are still very, very trusted. And I've been interviewing some of the Swedish journalists to talk about that. And they do all kinds of wonderful things to safeguard diversity. And they do think that the diversity and the transparency is part of why people trust them. And I think when you're both talking about policies, the problem with bringing up Scandinavia, first of all, if you want to be cheerful, read state aid to newspapers. There's loads of great ideas out there for how government can help support diverse, independent media. But the problem is always people say, well, that's Scandinavia. That's not us. How would it work in America? How would you allocate money to media outlets without it getting captured? So I think to add to your to-do list, I think has to be, we really need to think, seems a bit pie in the sky, but I think we also need to think about really how all of those great ideas around the world could actually be applied to us. I mean, when you were doing your study, Andrea, did you come up with any theories about trust and capture? Does one...
So one important component here that's related to this is we've been talking about supply and how there's many more sources, and in theory, right, we have everything is out there, the truth is out there, we could get... but an important theme is inequality, which is that so all of us in this room, we go on the internet, we get to the truth, we probably have 10 different sources, we even look at the opposition once in a while just to know what they're up to. What this kind of research shows is that when you look at individual, there is a large chunk of the population, sometimes half of it, that basically has very limited number of sources. Often they just watch TV, frankly. They're old people sometimes, or they're just bored, they're just not interested in news. This incredible inequality is also, I bet if you ran a question, do you trust the media? These people would be the ones who trust the media the least, yet they go to what they're used to. So I'm very interested in, you're engaged in supply side, in a sense, initiatives, which is to try and provide news in forms and to people who currently don't have them. This seems to be very important. What we've talked so far before is kind of more of a demand situation where we try to block certain oligarchs from exerting, but it would be very interesting to think about this type of initiatives.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that I think is kind of interesting about the Swedish model or the Japanese model or many others where you have strong public service broadcasting, and where the broadcaster has been established within a fairly strong institutional structure that assures its independence. As you pointed out, that the BBC has got 600 years of even more of parliamentary democracy or whatever it is. And they managed to create these walls between the political power and the media, either by special funding arrangements. The BBC, for example, funds the BBC through a subscription that everybody has to pay. It's like $175 or something a year, and these kinds of structures are really interesting because the countries that manage to do fairly decent public service broadcasting also tend to have generally better overall regulatory environments for media overall, because the parliament and the public are made aware of it through this debate about the payment of the $175 or through the conversation that takes place in the society. I had a conversation on the same trip that I was in Indonesia. On my way back, I stopped in Japan, and JICA, which is the Japanese International Cooperation Agency, which basically in its foreign aid on media development focuses on public service media. They're very proud of what they have done with their public service broadcaster, and they have a lot of data that shows that when people really want to know what's going on in the country, or when there's a crisis, or when there's something that they really care about, that's where they go. They go to the public service broadcaster. And JICA believes that societies that have that debate in their society does tend to improve their ability to regulate the media overall and to create a diversity of patterns of ownership inside those societies. And I think there's some data that kind of suggests that some of that is true. The problem that we have on that is that weak countries and countries that are, have really weak institutions never manage to set up those independent institutions. I mean, there are just pages and pages of reports about failed transitions of state broadcasters to public service broadcasters. Very few places have managed to do it. So this still, maybe we need to think less about broadcasting and more about other kinds of media, and we probably need to think more about how to build confident civil society organizations and legislators who can talk about the media environment in more detailed ways so that they understand what the dynamics of this system is, how complex it is, and how important it is to have local players. I mean, I think that the collapse of local news across the world, and I grew up in a small newspaper in South Carolina. That's where everybody said you get ink in your blood from hanging around a newspaper. And I was a little kid hanging out where my father and my mother worked in this little town newspaper. And I saw the extent to which that small community depended on the information that came out once and then eventually twice a week from the Lawrence Advertiser. And it was a kind of, this was no muckraking newspaper. It did not, attack the local politicians very often or even disclose, probably malfeasance. But the community loved this little newspaper because it covered what was happening in the community. And occasionally it would write an editorial that says, we should not do such and such. But it was it is, those kinds of relationships are collapsing in our society because people don't have those media in their midst anymore the way they used to, especially in the nether regions of the countries that we're talking about, in Russia or in this country. People are being less and less attached to that, so they are getting this other kind of media to which they have less affection for, and I think it's affecting the kinds of things that are possible in media regulation and other aspects of our societies.
Can I inject a note of optimism? So, in the past, if you wanted to supply news, you had to be like the BBC. You had to have this big monolithic organization. You have to have infrastructure, big buildings, and lots of journalism. I think now we are in a situation, because buying media is so cheap, we're in a situation where we're ready for some disruptive model where we give, rather than paying £175 a year to the BBC, we give little money here and there to young people who want to inform people in North Carolina. You just pay fellowships almost, and you're going to get a lot of competing information. And because it's competing, then it will just hopefully come out. So I'm much more optimistic. I don't think we've identified. Maybe you probably know much more about this, but we've not identified these disruptive model yet. But there is a chance that we will.
We're continually trying to help our partners innovate around the problem instead of solving the problem. I mean, that's kind of one of our mantras now, is that it's really important to, we used to think that we have to just train people how to do good journalism. Now we have to train them to actually make your content really attractive, make it informative, make it engaging. Do a telenova, do something that gets people's attention. I mean, we're in these attention economies, right?
Yeah.
And we're on the internet, and there are some innovative ways around and through that. But we're really at the very beginning of that, I think. And I think media development organizations need to start thinking much further out ahead of the problem in a lot of ways. And I think we are sort of captive to our own donor communities that aren't the most forward-looking always in terms of the kinds of ways that they're analyzing the problem. But I do want to see if the audience might have any questions. So if you mind, we could turn it over to take a few questions.
And one of our
from the
authors
audience.
is in the audience too,
Oh.
Ryan Powell, who wrote the
terrific.
Tanzania.
Okay, great. Well, let's get started then. So just identify yourself and
My name's Arnold Zeitlin. I've been teaching in China journalism. I've only had a chance to skim through this, and I see it focuses on publications and broadcast and certain websites. But could you comment more on government efforts to control the World Wide Web? Mr. Steenfeld mentioned briefly the hopes we all had for that, and maybe you could discuss how important it is that it remains free.
Well, I mean, I can maybe start off. Definitely, of course, it's a matter of freedom of expression. However, probably the issue that you raise in many ways is not so much one of crackdown or surveillance online, but again, mostly a business equation, where we see a situation that the main gatekeepers of the internet, no matter whether it's in China or in the Silicon Valley, are more or less beyond control and regulation. So who has a leverage here, and who is at least, let's say, on a level playing field with Facebook? I don't know of any. And just briefly, maybe coming back to the question of trust, which was raised, and I think which relates to this, don't confuse trust with truth. I mean, this is what we see when people trust in Breitbart. It's not so much about the truth, but it's about supporting their worldview. And this is what is also very convenient and in a way very human, because it's easy, much easier than going out every day and have your views challenged. And this is probably also one reason why fact-checking these days is so difficult, because that's not about the truth, but about beliefs. So how do you correct that? If you try, first of all, you have to repeat the lie to correct it then. And then you basically have always a response of those who believe in it, who feel confirmed in their beliefs if you attack them. And this is what I think we see on many levels happening these days.
Great. How about over here?
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Rafolu. I'm from Azerbaijan, and I cover the country. I want to single out the country, Azerbaijan, because it seems like they've gone a little, they've taken a little further steps. It's a country where president hands out free houses, to journalists. Like this year, we had more than 200 journalists receive those free apartments. There's an official narrative is that, who wouldn't like house, right? So we get some appreciation letters from international journalists, according to the presidential palace, that they even would like to, get one of those houses from their own governments. Unfortunately, they don't have that flexibility. So I want to, can you please remind us of those boundaries? When journalists receive free apartments from the government, what does that mean when it comes to the media freedom in the country? Thank you.
Someone want to take that?
I'm still gobsmacked by the idea of journalists getting apartments. Wow. Yeah, that's really back to the old ways, right? The velvet room.
I mean, I think that in one of the things that we really face in this field is building knowledge and good practice and ethics on both sides of the equation. So one of the main reasons that governments use for intervention in the media space is that the media is bad, or that it's corrupt, or that it is producing really very bad journalism. And in many cases, they are right. It is absolutely true. We have some really horrible journalism going on in the world today. Journalism that doesn't serve the needs of their readers, journalism that is biased, that is influenced by political positioning, that is paid for by the sources. Journalists are notoriously poorly paid across the world. So that is a problem that we really have to tackle at the same time that we tackle the other side of it, which is the role of government and the role of the enabling conditions in the country. So the skills of journalists is one dimension, and the quality of journalism. But the other dimension of quality journalism is the policies, the behaviors, the norms, the standards. Those things are critically important in this field. And this problem we're talking about here today on media capture is one of those environmental problems that it has to be tackled from those two dimensions. And getting quality journalism will only really happen when we do find a model that works, that ensures the independence of high quality journalism, that promise journalists a living wage, but which is not controlled or influenced or bought out by governments or presidents or whoever, or big companies. That's the vision that we're working towards, and we're a long way from reaching that ideal.
I mean, it might surprise you to hear that the German government is going a bit in that direction by discussing tax breaks for journalists, because it's more and more seen as a utility, and that's the rationale behind it. I mean, probably the difference is that it's non-conditional, other than in Azerbaijan, where you can only choose to either get a house as a gift or a prison cell. But maybe just also as a positive note, I think, which we believe is maybe helpful. If you consider what an average household, no matter in which country, pays for media consumption compared to the past, it's rather more than less. If you ask yourself what an advertising client of any size pays or has a budget for commercials compared to whatever time ago, it's rather more than less. This means there is enough money in the system. That's not the problem.
Yeah, but
the
this
problem
begs
is
the
distribution.
inequality.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in the good old days, let's say analog, the gatekeepers, broadcasters, publishers were taking in this revenue minus profit and reinvesting this into content, basically by employing journalists or commissioning content. While these days, the new gatekeepers are deducting their profits and reinvesting in technology, in self-driving cars, in drones, in thermostats, whatever. So this is, I think, the main problem, where hopefully also the solution lies, that the paradigm has shifted. I mean, analog basically meant that technology was enabling content, and today it's the other way around. Content is enabling technology.
Yeah, that's
Yeah, but
absolutely right.
also, I mean, an important point is that all this money, all these advertisers are interested in rich people. They're not, there's this 50% of our societies that no one's interested in because they don't have much purchasing power. Hence, we don't create news that are interesting to them. We don't cater to them. And then they're left at the mercy of whoever controls those mass news. So I think we
Inequality is a big
inequality
part
is
of
a
it.
big
Yeah.
component of
And
that.
it's not even just inequality based on income. It's also based on language groups. I mean, we see that the English language media is very powerful and spreading very quickly, and there's a lot of English language content. But if you are Burmese or even Shan, or you from Kachin State, or you have those are really being left behind, and that's a huge issue that I think people need to think about a lot more as well. Other questions? How about in the back, the person with his hand way up?
My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is related to the gentleman from Azerbaijan. And I want to give the example of Pakistan. When people try to, big conglomerate, powerhouse media try to take some advantage to meet their own business interest, and then they try to establish guilty to the people who are in power. For example, in Pakistan, Prime Minister has to resign, and new gentleman, Hakan Abbasi, he is very competent person. So just because some elements of media are jealous, or just because they want to destabilize, they are alleging him that he too is a corrupt and he made huge amount of money in some kind of pipelines. Without any evidence, they are just trying to establish him guilty by this association of his with the ex-prime minister who resigned. So I mean, how can you reform media when media itself is trying to take advantage to meet their own business interest, or they are just jealous because, like in the case of current prime minister, because he is very competent and he belongs to a very well-established family, and he was educated, as a matter of fact, from here. He has master from George Washington University. But media is after him without proving anything, and they are trying to establish that somehow he too is a guilty. Thanks.
You want to take another question?
Yeah, let's take one more.
I mean, just maybe one quick remark. I think it's a good example illustrating that it is also in the best interests of politicians to get it right. So, I mean, if you have a situation in a country where, with, let's say, rogue media, basically violating all professional standards, as a result of media capture, then it is also not only damaging the democratic state or governance of a country, but it is also damaging individual politicians, as you just quite rightly say. So you get in a bit of a wag the dog situation, where in the beginning maybe you, as a politician, you think colluding with business interests helps you, but then the tide turns against you at one point, and this is a situation we see in many places.
Great.
The woman in the yellow,
Where?
sweater,
There.
she's
Here
been
you go.
asking for a while.
Okay.
Hi, my name is Rachel Ossett. I'm a reporter here in Washington. My question is what impact all of the media capture happening around the world, what that will mean when here in Washington, President Trump's comments aside, we're beginning to see impacts within the Congress in terms of lawmakers' articulation of support for free and fair press, free and fair press when it comes to actual policy. House Foreign Affairs Chairman Ed Royce, very famously a strong proponent of Radio Free Europe, Radio Asia, talks a lot about how important that reporting was in bringing down the Soviet Union. But then he's also supporting the efforts by Saudi Arabia to shut down Al Jazeera. I know Al Jazeera isn't the same thing as media capture, but it does provide some reporting on the region that you aren't getting from other outlets. And so just that disconnect that I'm seeing on Capitol Hill makes me worried about what happens even when President Trump is no longer in office.
Anybody want to take that?
I definitely think that we have a responsibility in the US and in Europe to give a good example. Similar to competition policy. Competition policy was started in these countries, and then we showed that it was a good idea. We showed that consumers benefited from it. I am not sure that currently the US and Europe are giving the good example. If anything, things are getting worse rather than better, and so we definitely should do that.
And clearly people around the world do follow what they see happening in the US and Europe.
I mean, there's an interesting notion. Currently, we mentioned the Czech Republic. I mean, I come from Germany, and I remember after the Berlin Wall came down, there was a notion that, our kind of Western model would trickle over East, slowly but surely. And currently what we see is just the opposite, that, kind of different flavors of governance and how you run a country and populist tendencies come over the other way.
Yeah, no, there's some very damaging things happening. We're seeing around the world responses in places like Cambodia to say, well, if the President of the United States is saying this, we have impunity and freedom now to act, to shut down our media and close our media space because it's fake news.
I'm also starting to lose patience with everybody bashing the media, and journalists are always so polite and nice, and we just heard Mark saying, mea culpa, but I think we also have to look at the motives of all the people that are bashing the media, I teach at Columbia, so bashing the universities, and often they, it's a power grab. They want power, and they want to undermine the people that are going to oppose them with reasoned logic, reporting, and research.
And I mean, there's a saying like, show me what your media landscape looks like and I tell you which country you live in. So really the state of the media is a good litmus test, and you understand more or less immediately what the political culture is in the country.
Yeah, right. Let's take a couple. How about the gentleman in the tie and then Harlan there? These two?
Thank you so much. My name is Malik Siraj Akbar. I'm a journalist from Pakistan and a former fellow here at NED. My question is related to what Rachel was just asking, bringing the issue back to Washington. Yesterday, there was a report in the New York Times about something that is very close to all of our hearts, is the financial problems Newseum is facing. And it's a big journalistic institution which might be shutting down if the financial problems are not addressed. Jeff Bezos having acquired the Washington Post. Do we see all these institutions at one point being acquired by all these rich people who own big corporations? Would that be a good thing or a bad thing? You know, people think, okay, the Washington Post is a lot more stable financially today. What if Bezos also helps the Newseum, survive? So would that be a good thing or a bad thing? What's happening here? Thank you.
Take one more.
Let's take one more.
Yeah.
Going back to the question of concentration, we're seeing at the same time media concentration being wielded by governments as a way to control media and harm media. There are a number of countries that I can think of very easily where the only independent media actually has a large share of attention because people actually trust it. The definition of concentration can be so easily manipulated as well. So I think it's very hard to have a regime that really captures every possible environment where media concentration can be deployed as a definition. But to the extent that it can be, you can define it in a way that really makes sense, I think it would be very powerful, because it is becoming more and more a weapon rather than something that's used for power.
So we've got a couple questions about benevolent ownership and benevolent concentration in a way. So, is it always bad to have oligarchs own and invest? And
let me say something first, and then Andrea can correct me if I'm. But I think concentration may not be the only thing we need to look at. I mean, concentration can be a response to market natural things that are happening in the market, and sometimes it can be a positive thing when a company is able to get a sizable share and then create economies of scale and to actually create some ability to improve its situation. And when I was working on this, I didn't see concentration in and of itself as being really the problem. What I see as being the problem are the interests of the owners. And this is why I think your work is so important at RSF. What are the motives of the owners and getting an understanding of that, and also finding ways to ensure that there is a diversity of views available and in the public space, so that the public marketplace of ideas are not dominated by any one player. So my sense of this is that it's going to be more complicated than just applying antitrust rules against the media companies. I think it's going to be a more complex calculation, but I think there are ways of doing that, of ways of calculating who is getting attention. I think that's really what you're doing, I suppose. And it's not so much about the concentration in and of itself. On the Bezos question, I would say that I hope the Newseum finds a way to fund itself. The real problem that we have in our situation right now is that people are not really willing to pay what it costs to generate high quality media in the current environment. And that market distortion, that inability right now for every market player to find an equilibrium in the market for its product is a real problem. I think eventually it will happen. Eventually, information is valuable. High quality information is really valuable to society. And I think people eventually will be willing to pay for it. They might not pay as much as they used to pay for home delivery of the New York Times, but there's probably some way of funding through audiences high-quality journalism at some level, and hopefully we will find that. It may mean more journalists working from home and, you know, doing it at a lower cost level. But maybe you could respond a little bit to this question of the regulatory.
I completely agree the competition policy is not the final answer, but it is part of the answer, because if the Czech Republic had had a different, a tougher competition policy regime, this guy here would not have accumulated, so he's got 2 newspapers and a TV station, right? I think we can get to a competition policy where this is difficult. It will not be the solution of every problem, because we still have the Turkish case where, you know, but it is it already eliminates one problem. And if in my own country, Berlusconi had not been allowed to basically control the whole commercial television sector, he would maybe not have gotten elected. So that's already a part of the solution. It's just one modest part. The Jeff Bezos question is so interesting. I don't know where I stand, because I would like to have a rule that applies to Jeff Bezos and what's the other one? Sheldon. Yeah. So I would like.
Jobs just bought a controlling interest in the Atlantic too. So, yeah, it's happening.
So I don't know what this rule is.
I was wondering in the beginning of the Trump administration whether the only people that would be able to stand up to him would be zillionaires who didn't have stock listed companies. So if it was going to come down to like Bezos and Bloomberg, but clearly, even if they're not stock listed and afraid of, I mean, I think a few months ago everyone was afraid of Trump tweeting about your company could mean your share price falling. I don't know if we'll keep having the same effect if it keeps happening. But also there's obviously so many other ways that these people are vulnerable, right? Because they own big businesses and laws can change.
Yeah.
So
I
I'm
mean,
not
it's
sure. But as for museums, they always need to be subsidized, right? Museums, opera, all of those good cultural things. And zillionaires and robber barons have always paid for them. So I don't see why we should expect that to change until we move to Sweden, where the government will fund museums.
Yeah, but talking about Sweden and the concentration thing, I mean, it was mentioned earlier a few times. Sweden is probably the most concentrated media market of all. I mean, it's basically 2 families, and still it's very pluralistic. To an extent, because you have very strong independent public media, but also because simply of the societal context and the culture, which you cannot regulate. And on the philanthropy thing, I mean, put yourself in the shoes of an economics editor at the Washington Post and you get a piece on Amazon on your desk. I mean, this is where self-censorship starts. Probably for the Washington Post, it's predominantly good that he invested. Nobody really knows about his motives. So it's really hard to tell. I mean, it begins with transparency. But also maybe I mentioned this at another occasion, but just to give you maybe some financial figures from, again, I apologize, Germany, which is my reference point. The overall media sector in Germany is worth around 50 billion euros per year, including books, cinema, everything. And if you deduct subscription, sales revenues, and public media subsidies, whatever, about half of that, 25 billion, is advertising. And this is basically what's at stake. This is what goes away to the Silicon Valley and what's draining the sector. And this is an amount, 25 billion, which is even beyond oligarchs. I talk about a yearly amount, beyond the reach of oligarchs to substitute. So we think in Germany that maybe through crowdfunding and philanthropy, we might get to a point of, we're not there yet, but maybe 25 million per year, which is 0.1% of that amount.
You know, there's a very interesting report I would commend to, it's not on media capture, but the government of Canada did an interesting report earlier this year called The Shattered Mirror. I don't know if anyone saw it, but they had 10 recommendations at the end, and one of them was that the public broadcaster in Canada should stop spending money on digital advertising, full stop. Because they spend $20 million a year with Google and Facebook. And the Minister of Information said, why are we doing that?
Right.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be doing that. So that was an interesting, kind of, how do we find the chinks in that, yeah, it is super interesting.
Take some 3 questions quickly.
Okay, 3 more. Okay, how about the front row, there, and there.
Good afternoon, I'm Todd Wiggins. On a simple level, we see people outside in DC selling what they call street sense newspapers, which is obviously designed to help support them and get them involved in journalism. And so is there any comparable examples in other countries that you could give where people are kind of trying to step up and be like middle class folks, and so they're getting an opportunity to develop their own business based around their own journalism?
Okay, next question. Take one more.
Yes, Will Faragaro, consultant on conflict governance and media. I guess we're getting late here, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about policy responses that you're seeing, and what might be effective. And one of the things one of the examples you used was I think the Coca-Cola example, where certain people in the country didn't have access because the conglomerate owned the media, which was not advertising that product. And so I'm thinking about, what I'd like to hear your comments on is thinking about different types of coalitions. If we're saying that government is accommodating or captured or controlled by these media conglomerates, how does civil society think differently about coalitions? And I'm wondering if kind of the multi-stakeholder approach of the Internet Governance Forum and the Internet policy world is relevant, perhaps even on a local level, of thinking differently about different allies, local business, chambers of commerce, and so on. So that's just kind of my question about how to think about coalitions for different policy responses.
Great. And one last question over here. We'll do all 3.
My name is Ahmed from Internews. I'm just going to quick mention about my experience with Egyptian media, because I think it is almost like everybody mentioned here about the problem with businessmen owning the media and the government on the other side owning the other half of the media and television and the newspaper. But I'm just talking about a different phenomena which I notice now. Because in the beginning, after the revolution, most of the media was supporting the government and General Sisi 100%. And now, most of the Egyptian people started to see the media exactly like what the situation here, like a fake media. They are not trusting them anymore. So if there is a number of independent newspapers which are really against the government, but they are suffering. They can't stand against the government because they almost lost completely the support of the public, because they combined everybody in the same basket, and now they can't trust anybody. So even if we have a good media and good journalism, because of this particular situation, they are not getting any support. Thank you.
Okay, so we have 3 questions. Media as a pathway upward mobility, and I think the multi-stakeholder coalitions. You actually write about that in your chapter a little bit, Mark. And then finally, the idea that people lose trust in captured media and then in media more
I
generally.
could do a quickie on the upward pathway.
Yeah.
So I guess everyone in this room who works in media development has seen around the world loads and loads of startups of all kinds. So there's lots of people passing out print papers around the world, any big city you go to. And there's lots of people starting online sites and crowdfunding and getting money from subscribers and doing all kinds of creative things. So whether we did a study a couple years ago called Publishing for Peanuts, where we looked at media startups around the world, and Ryan worked on that. They don't usually get very big, but it's absolutely possible for people to earn enough from crowdfunding and subscription, a little bit of advertising, and other things, guides and events and stuff to support 1 or 2 people. And I'm doing sort of a sequel to that study right now.
We've actually seen some crazy business models in parts of the world. For example, a little media company in the Central African Republic that bought a bunch of plastic chairs and started renting them out for events and used that to subsidize their media. Another one that was harvesting rice and becoming a central location for rice farmers to pass out the rice and taking a little cut off the top, and that went to support their media. We know hairdressing salons in Central Europe that are, so there's a lot of creative ways that people are using to kind of do these blended business models, because the media itself is the goal and it's the outcome, and it's important that, but not a lot of get-rich-quick schemes, I'll tell you that.
Talking about coalitions, we are trying to engage more and more advertisers. I'm sorry if I'm repeating myself at this point, but if we speak about trust, I think it's important maybe to extend the equation of trust from this bilateral consumer, citizen and media to a triangle involving advertisers, because they also have a trust issue. I mean, trust and brands go along towards the consumer, but also trust between advertising clients and the media is deteriorating a lot. I mean, if Facebook is selling target groups to advertisers which are larger than the census, so more people that actually exist, there is a huge deterioration in trust of advertisers towards the big gatekeepers these days. So there is also, I think, a momentum to use and to move, be it even through regulation or co-regulation, or also voluntarily as a corporate social responsibility to engage them.
Yeah, and I think the important point there is that, you know, Google and Facebook, their money is coming from advertisers. So they care about what those guys think about them. So if you think about the power relationships in the ecosystem, sort of, it's important to understand who owes who what, kind of in that space.
Let me just say something about the multi-stakeholder governance approach and coalitions, because I think that's really the most important thing that we can do. If you look at places that have actually undergone significant reforms and where there have been successful reform programs implemented, it has happened as a result of a strong civil society making coalitions with members of government and also with the private sector, trying to come up with a acceptable approach to the media in a country. So that is really where it's at. If you know, Sylvia Wasteboard has written on this. I cite a couple of other works in my chapter that where this is really the real challenge is to build the capacity of those civil society organizations to engage in these debates and to do so in a way that leads to policy reform. That's why I also think that the multi-stakeholder governance of the internet is an interesting experiment, and I hope it works, because right now we have two basic models. One is the sovereign countries like China and others who want to assert control of the internet at their borders, and a more global system that is trying to attract new voices. And what we're trying to do here at CIMA and NED is to build the capacity of civil society organizations to participate in those debates about internet governance, where a lot of these questions about what is the role of advertisers and the intermediaries, and how do we create a level playing field for all of those players on the internet? Are we going to allow small upstart, little guys in the middle of nowhere to start a media enterprise in a way that costs next to nothing? Or are we going to create a system that's only usable for the big players and who get to everybody in an assured way? That's what they're trying to do, and I think it's really important for civil society and for voices outside the global north to get involved in those kinds of things, and they need to get together and understand these things and create coalitions to influence the debate. So I think it's critically important what you said.
Maybe briefly, we'll do the media ownership monitor in Egypt next year, which it's going to be a huge adventure, I believe, to say the least.
Great. Any more questions? Okay, take two more. So let's take these fine. Okay, got four more. Let's just take all four.
Real quick, real short.
Yeah, short questions. We're getting close here. Yep. Here, this woman there, then this gentleman.
I just wanted to mention there's been talk about different business models and little money for journalists and going beyond training. I work for an organization that is crowdfunding for journalists around the world. We look for independent journalists to help, and we raise sums of up to $2,000. And they go through a pretty rigorous application process, so we ensure their independence as much as we can. And it's working pretty well so far. I think our next challenge, our challenge is to get known and to get enough applicants. I really didn't think it was going to be such a problem finding journalists that needed money. And then we also like to track the impact of the projects that our journalists do. And because they're still, some of them are still stuck in small independent outlets that are being strangled because they don't have access to the advertising money that the bigger, because of issues like media capture, their impact is still more limited than we want. So we have to work on that. So I want to mention the organization is Press Start, and if anyone wants to, if anybody knows journalists who could need our help, we deal with countries that are partly free or not free. Please come see me after the conversation.
That's really interesting.
Hi, yeah, thanks everyone. So I wrote the chapter on Tanzania in the book, and I just wanted to kind of briefly comment on that and then ask a quick question. Feel free to ask me any questions afterwards about it. But in the context in which I wrote this, I was doing a broader dissertation on the nexus of institutional communications, citizen receivership of news, and the media itself. And out of that, I ended up writing this chapter, which kind of looks into, to some extent, the history of regulation, why and how colonial legislation had been then turned into what we see in the immediate regulatory space today, only to find out that in 2016, the Media Services Act replaced the 1976 Newspaper Act, which actually regressed even further. So it didn't go in the direction anyone wanted it to. But yeah, I guess I say all of that to bring up the nature of trust and audience agency and receivership agency, because I think it's it brings people to different sources of news, such as local communications networks. And so I was studying a conflict that came out of communications narratives coming from the state and other sort of mismanaged fake news, let's say, about a natural resource project. And the people had gone to other sources of news locally, not necessarily FM stations, but like religious orders or different institutions locally. And that was a really fascinating find, and to see really exactly who they are trusting and where they're getting their news from. But yeah, I guess to comment as well on potential for media freedom and these types of multi-stakeholder groups. I know in Tanzania today there's a coalition of local media advocacy groups that are really trying to push on a local level responses to the recent changes in communications regulations. And I don't know how much support they're getting internationally or who even knows about what's going on. It was brought to my attention. I didn't see it in any public forum otherwise. So that I guess there are subtle answers to that. But a quick question on top of all of this is, in an age where independent media is oftentimes funded through nonprofit ventures, whether that's philanthropy, whether that's international agencies, how much legitimacy is afforded institutions like the World Bank or the IMF or others, or OECD, for example, that might be involved in that process, as opposed to, say, the Chinese Development Bank, or to what extent can incentives for greater media freedoms succeed when you have these sort of competitive funding sources, I would say, for more broadly economic development?
Yeah, good question.
Good question.
So two more, right?
How you doing? My name is Theodorus. I'm from the Gilman Journal. Excuse me. I'm originally from Ethiopia. So there's a lot of repression that goes on in Ethiopian journalism. But it's easy to kind of look at the exotic and far off lands and say it happens there, but it happens in America too. And it's just in a very more subtle way when corporatism has taken over the media landscape. how are you supposed to speak truth to power when you're being paid by the powerful? This is a softer form of censorship, but independent journalism is going away because we can't compete with Washington Post, CNN, New York Times, and it's not these. I'm not trying to diminish journalists that work there, but in a way, I know there's a lot of good folks that work at CNN, for example, and there's a lot of good folks that might work at other mainstream media outlets. But at the core of it, if they're being paid by very powerful people, by oligarchs that you mentioned, it's not only in Czechoslovakia or in Italy, it's right here in America as well. But you can't depend on billionaires to not pay attention to what they want to pay attention to. So really, it comes back on the consumer. We're the ones that have to make a decision whether or not we want to keep feeding into the monster, or if we're going to give empower independent journalism.
Can I break in, because
Sure.
you're now on the subject of my last book and my next book. So I just want to very quickly say, and not toot my own horn, but I edited a book with help from many people in this room called Global Muckraking, which was a collection of investigative reporting from developing countries over the last 150 years. And I've got another one coming out that's the first ever collection of African investigative reporting. And to both of you, what I want to say is, paradoxically, despite capture, when we look at a lot of the investigative reporting that really had impact, a lot of it was actually done by one or two people with their newsletter, crusading people. And so I do want to remind both of you, and really everyone in this room, that the lone crusading journalist is an enduring part of the ecosystem, and as we worry about capture, may continue to play a really important role. I won't say more because you may want to address some of the other interesting points.
Well, one objection, I think journalists are not crusading, but that's a more ethical question. And then briefly to the question of how or should states invest in media or pay for it. That's just a personal observation. I think they should not, at least not to the extent to buy content, basically. The European Commission is notoriously well known for doing that. On the other hand, I mean, the project I mentioned, the Media Ownership Monitor, is funded by development aid coming from the German government. And this has the background of, I think, an increasing understanding that in the whole development, let's say, spectrum, and Germany was always, I think, well known for building bridges and drilling wells all around the world. This is not really getting to the core of the problems, which are always about rule of law and democracy and transition, where media plays an important role. And overall spending in the development aid sector for media, you have the data, is around globally about 1% or 2%.
Less than 0.5%
and that,
overall.
I think, represents the problem. So investing as a government in these, let's say, structural things, I believe is useful and should be done more, and I think this understanding is growing.
So we're basically out of time. I don't know if any of you have final thoughts you want to share. I could do a summary and say this is a really hard problem. It's got a lot of dimensions. I think we've unpacked a number of them here today. I think it is a new time in capture. I think there are some new dynamics. I think we do need new ways of thinking about it. The old saw of diverse pluralistic markets are going to solve it. Just that model is not really robust enough for, I think, for what we're facing right now, even though of course that is still part of the solution. But I think we need to be thinking more broadly. I think coalitions are important. I think civil society needs an increasingly important role. Transparency is key. I think thinking about engagement and thinking about the individual as the point of research as opposed to thinking top down but bottom up, I think is fascinating. And thank you, Anya, for putting this really thoughtful volume together. So thank you all for coming.